So Seth Silvers, founder and CEO of Story on Media and Marketing. Thank you so much for joining me on Podcast Junkies.
Thank you, Harry. This is great. And yeah, super happy to be on. This is one of the shows that I find myself listening to throughout the year and always enjoying.
Well, I appreciate that. You know, it's as you might relate to, and given you're in the production world and in the podcasting space, sometimes you feel like you're just in your own empty room recording content and you're just wondering like, who's listening to this? And so when I go to a podcast, I was just at an indoor farming conference for my second show, Vertical Farming Podcast. And it was nice to see some like fans of the show kind of tell me they were like binging the episodes on the way to the conference. And so it's really humbling, you know, when you get to connect with listeners directly.
Yeah. And for me, like I'm more on we produce shows for different clients. And so it's less of like the listener relationship, but sometimes we get to see that for clients and we're with clients in those settings for them. And it's like, oh, this is really making an impact. And it's clear that people are listening to the shows and they're enjoying them. It's good to have those moments to remind ourselves of like, this actually really matters. This is actually a really significant medium.
So remind me again, was it a email outreach from you where we connected first?
First, I want to say it was probably one of the conferences. I think the first time that I remember meeting you was maybe at PodFest a couple of years ago.
Okay.
And at that conference, I was talking about like NFT integration and crypto integration. In
Oh,
podcasts.
yeah, that's right. That's right.
And so that was something that for about a year, I was spending a lot of time like really trying to figure out. And I still think that's kind of like the future of memberships is going to be that type of technology. But I was really putting a lot of effort and time into figuring out like, is this the right time for podcasters to be able to use some of this stuff in order to engage with their community? So I think that was the first time. And then you know how it goes. We run into each other at a couple different conferences and have conversations here and there.
I think what's great about my show specifically, because of the nature of it being super meta, and with the last couple of episodes, I think some of the past guests have been referring it to as podcast therapy, because you can just come on and just kind of like talk about what we're seeing behind the scenes. And, you know, we've all got our polished appearances on for the shows and for the shows we produce for clients. But like, you know, it's always interesting to see what's happening and what folks are going through. So it'd be interesting to talk a little shop on this episode. So just to kind of rewind the clock back a little bit, I know you got a little bit of a marketing background, but I'm curious, you know, not having to go through the entire resume, but talk a little bit about the roads that led you to podcasting.
Yeah, so I started in the nonprofit space. I started nonprofit in high school, fell in love with storytelling. And that was when I really began to realize like I loved bringing people together. I loved the idea that you can bring a lot of people together from different backgrounds with a good story. Like if we can all kind of like, that stories really bring people together in unique ways. Thought I was going to stay in the nonprofit space. And then as I went through college, was kind of realizing like, man, I really like the business side of things and felt like my giftings were maybe going a little bit that direction, and ended up becoming a marketing director for a nonprofit. And after college for about 2 or 3 years, I was kind of thinking, it's like you're like building a business in the back of your mind. And so I was kind of like filling out notebooks and I didn't know what I was doing, but I was, you know, writing down business plans. And the question that was in my head was, would it work for businesses to market through storytelling? Like that was the question that for a couple of years was just kind of, it was like the lens that I was looking at media through.
Sure.
And so I'd see these little examples here and there. But at the end of the day, I realized I support the brands, the companies that I love. I support them because I know more about their story. I know more about them than just here's the product that we sell. And oftentimes I pay more for companies that I align with their values and their story. And so I was beginning to realize like, I'm not shaking this. Like I feel really connected to this kind of ideology, if you will. And so I started Story on Media. This was 8 years ago in 2015. And so I started the company and said, I'm going to build an agency that helps small businesses market through storytelling. And I thought that was really, really specific, but it was really, really broad, and you can kind of call anything and everything storytelling. And so for about 5 years, got to work with a ton of different small businesses, some medium, some big, but mostly small businesses, helping them to craft their stories, helping them to figure out kind of the media landscape. Wasn't really thinking about podcasting. Was really trying to figure out what is the right medium for businesses to be able to communicate through storytelling. And then I started my own podcast, which we've since kind of retired or sunsetted. It's still out there, but we're not actively publishing to it. And I began to see in my own show how much of a connection I had with the people that were listening. It was really odd. It was so much different than any other medium. And I remember my show was not big. We would get like, I don't know, a couple hundred listens.
Sure.
And it was a local show. And I remember like walking across the street and some stranger was like, "Oh, you're the guy on the podcast." And I was like, "What in the world?" So I talked with him for like 10 seconds before like the little stoplight turns. And it was just this interesting revelation of, oh, this is a really unique medium for connecting with people. It's then kind of like many people that have gotten into podcast production, you start your own and then you start producing a couple others and start, okay, well, I can help with other people that are podcasting that maybe don't know what they're doing, or maybe I'm like half a step ahead of them.
Yeah.
And so I had a couple shows, and then in 2020 came to kind of a fork in the road business wise, where I was still doing a ton of different projects. And I realized like I really need to focus. Like I either need to like focus and actually start to see the business grow, or I needed to shut it down. But it wasn't doing me any good to continue to kind of just like say yes to everything and pretend I'm focused, when in reality I was kind of all over the place. And so that was when I took a step back, looked at podcasting, and realized our podcasting clients are the ones that I enjoy working with the most. I feel like we're giving them really good value, and they've been with us for longer than our other clients. And so I was like, all right, it's kind of checking these boxes. So I gave myself 4 to 6 months to bring in new podcasting clients and to kind of rebuild the business. And I say the rest is history because I'm still doing it and I want to keep doing it.
Yeah.
But it wasn't necessarily easy. But it's been, the better phrase would be like, the rest was rocky, but I've been more okay with it.
Lots to unpack there. I'm curious, when you talk to businesses in that early work about storytelling, the importance of storytelling and building that into your company's brand and marketing, for folks that are interested in that topic, that they have a business and they want to maybe change up how they approach, how they sell, or how they position themselves to their market, what are some things that companies should be thinking about, and maybe have to kind of repackage what they currently do from a marketing perspective? But what do they have to think about if they want to be perceived as a company that really puts story first in terms of their messaging?
Yeah, it's there's so much to dissect there. I think when I started Story On, that was right around the time that Donald Miller published Story Brand. And I had actually remembered one of the videos that I saw, I think it was either in college or shortly after college, that just absolutely stuck with me, was a TED Talk by Nancy Duarte. And she was breaking down the hero's journey, but also breaking down in a very analytical way some of the best presentations of our time in speeches. So she went into like Martin Luther King Jr.'s speech. She went into Steve Jobs. She went into all these different things and broke them down. And I began to see like, oh, there's a science to storytelling. And then I remember learning about the hero's journey. And that's become a lot more popularized now. And I think people realize like, oh, you're going on this journey. But a lot of businesses are still getting it wrong because they think that it's their hero's journey. And I think from a marketing perspective, that the simple shift of realizing that as a business that you are a guide and not the hero, that like your customer is the hero and they have dreams and they have passions and they have things that they want to accomplish. And hopefully your role is like Yoda on the back of Luke, whispering things into their ear that kind of, you're whispering your services and your products and your blogs and your podcast episodes. And hopefully those things are helping them get to their dream. That simple shift is huge for businesses. And then when you start creating, the next piece is when you start actually creating content that is positioning you as a guide, that's saying, hey, we want to help guide you. I think from a podcasting standpoint, it's such a perfect medium to be able to do that. And I like to advise our clients, and even when I'm working on shows, be like, man, what if only one person listened to this show? Like, would it change their life? Like, would it make enough of an impact for it to be worth it? And I think we should be looking at it in that way. And so I think when it's coming back to like, how can brands do this to make sure they're kind of story forward? I think you have to get clarity on whose story you're telling and what content you're telling, but then you have to actually be telling the stories. Like there's plenty of data now that shows your audience is actually expecting you to be talking about the impact that you're making. It's not kind of like if they're wondering like, where is the content, which is very different than it was 10 years ago.
Yeah. It's always interesting when you come across the hero's journey and Joseph Campbell, and then you start to learn about what George Lucas did and how he
Mhm.
met and then how that drove what he created with Star Wars. And obviously that's an iconic movie. I actually saw it in the theaters and probably dating myself for sure. But it was, when done correctly, and you see it occasionally in movies and obviously books as well that are well done, there's something about it that clearly, as the person consuming the content, you can resonate with, because, we're all going through those heroes' journeys in our own lives, whether someone is there to document it or whether we or even aware that we're going through a hero's journey. If we look back, and if I look back at my life, I'm like, oh wow, I can see those arcs. I can see like the peaks, I can see some valleys, I can see just kind of like figuring out what it is I wanted to do with my life. And it could be like a hero's journey with my business or a hero's journey with my personal life. And you just, once you see that framework, it's like you can't unsee it, because you start to see it
Totally.
in different places.
Yeah, you for sure can't unsee it. It kind of changes the way that you look at things for a long time, which I think is great.
Have you noticed, or have you been able to map a hero's journey in your own personal life?
That's a good question. I haven't thought about that. I haven't looked at it from that perspective. I mean, there's certainly, I feel very aware of the role of guides, and like the role of mentors here in different places. In college, there was several kind of business mentors that I got to see them build very successful businesses so that they could give back. That was the motivation behind it. And some of their businesses were very connected to a cause, and others were not at all. It was like, well, here's an opportunity. Somebody's going to be filling this need. So we're going to fill this need and do it really well and make a ton of money so that we can give to things that we care about. And so those were some people that were super influential in my life and kind of helped to, going into college, I really thought it was, you make an impact or you make money. And if you make money, you're funding the impact. And if you make an impact, then you're not making much money. You're just kind of doing the Lord's work, if you will. And so that the separation between that broke down for me, where I realized like, oh, business is actually a very good way to make an impact.
Yeah.
And so there's definitely been guides along the way. Even now, I feel like I've tried to surround myself with other podcast agencies and build relationships with other agency owners that some would say are competitors. And in one way, that's me surrounding myself with kind of a collective guide that I can kind of learn from. For maybe I'm doing things better in one way than this person, but they're doing things better in one way than the other. But probably collectively in my community, there's somebody that's doing something better in every aspect of our business. And so I think that I've definitely tried to surround myself with those guides, because I feel like I'm building everything from scratch. I didn't like work for a big agency before this. So it's kind of all felt like, okay, well, I want to do this. So how are we going to figure out how to do it? And it's usually not my great ideas.
Yeah, I think I definitely like that idea, because I own an agency as well. And I've had several agency owners on this show, and you as well. And I think this idea of abundance mindset. It's not really that scarcity mindset where you're just like, oh, there's only a certain amount of business. And I've even like niched down into like specifically like who I want to work with. And I'm very spiritual, so kind of like lean towards that in terms of like the types of shows we work on, the types of shows that light me up. And I just seem to attract like that type of business and those types of like business owners. I've even, through some work I've done with a coach, if you look at my LinkedIn, it says I'm the cosmic conduit for awakened souls ready to transmit their message. So it's a very like polarizing message, because it'll attract or immediately repel people, which is great, which I always tell people, like, you should be repelling people as fast as you're attracting them as well.
Yeah, I think that's great. And I mean, we've seen similar things of like, even on my own journey, I just think like attracts like. So at any given time, probably over half of our clients I'm going to be pretty aligned with on a values level. And that hasn't necessarily been intentional. I think it's just kind of what ends up happening. And I've seen it with other companies too, where if their goal is just to produce as many podcasts as we can and just get as many episodes out as we can and as much content out as we can. And there's a place for that. I'm not necessarily saying that's always bad, but the type of clients that you're going to attract are probably going to be clients that are coming in and valuing quantity over quality. And so I think in almost any way, it's like we're probably transmitting our values in more ways than we think. And that's something in the last year our team has gotten really, really tried to like get really clear on, is what are our values and how are they guiding us? And we've been more clear on communicating those to our clients and prospective clients as kind of a filter of like, do you fit or do you not? And I've really liked that.
You mentioned values a couple of times there, and I think about as companies and as business owners and having worked with coaches myself, there's always the inevitable, like, let's work on our vision statement and let's work on our values. What are we, aligned with? What do we represent? Who do we want to work with? What lights us up? When you think about your personal values, do you feel like they just evolved over time? Or if you even think back to growing up, did you inherit them from your family?
I think the personal values are a lot harder to figure out than the business values. Like so the last 6 months or so, I've been going through the process of, we're kind of like self-implementing the EOS, or the Entrepreneur Operating System.
Yeah.
And so, long story short, they have this like 2-page kind of business plan that has, your values and where you want to be in a year, and a lot of really specific information that's super, super valuable. But it caused beginning to like work through that caused me to really think through like the business values and the personal values. Like there should definitely be alignment. And so then it caused me to start to wonder my personal values. There's definitely a lot of values. Like I really value spirituality and my faith. And a lot of that does come from my family and community, but also how I interact with that looks so different now than it did when, I was maybe 18 years old. And so I think there's been evolution in how maybe I interact with these values, where it's like, man, family is super important and faith is really important to me. But there's also like added values to that now, in how I interact with those are different. So I think the personal ones have stayed the same, but they evolve as I become a more mature person. And then I think on the business side, it was really looking at like, what are some of the core convictions? Like what are some of the flags that I want to like put in the ground for our company? And almost thinking about how do some of the values that I have, and I feel like I've been given a lens to look at the world differently than you have. And I think that's a beautiful thing. And so then I think the values for the company was kind of like thinking through, how do these values translate to like economics, to like a business, and kind of thinking about it from that way.
It's interesting as a business owner, you did mention family, and it's something that I've been thinking about a lot recently, because coming from a corporate mindset, I was in corporate for 20 plus years. So it was literally like I had to, depending on where I was living at the time, I'm getting up at like 6:30 to catch the bus to the subway, to get into the city, to make sure you're like literally sitting at your desk at like 9 a.m. because the door to the office was visible to everyone on the floor. So everyone knew, like, you come in 9:15, you're just like, hey, Seth, like, did you have a long night or something? Like, it's like, so it's interesting, but it's probably speaks to something bigger about like how we're all been indoctrinated into that rat race. But breaking out of that, as a business owner, it's taken some time, and slowly over time now, thanks to my partner who's got a more flexible schedule, she's helped me see the importance of just not waking up with an alarm clock and easing my way into the day, and being flexible with my time and not so rigid with what I do, and that I have to be like at a certain place at a certain time. So I've tried to, even with my scheduling now, because of some work I've done with coaches, it's this idea of like planning my week from the middle out. So my Tuesday, Wednesdays, and Thursdays tend to be booked with like calls like this and interviews and client calls. But I try to leave my Monday and my Friday like open for the personal work, catch up work, some Cal Newport deep work possible. I see that book on your shelf as well.
Yep.
So just kind of thinking about that. And I'm wondering how your relationship to that balance has changed over time. I know there's no such thing as work-life balance. It's just a seesaw.
Yeah.
It's constantly going up and down.
Yeah. My story is kind of a little bit reversed in some ways, because my first job out of college was working with a family foundation, and then we were kind of merging that foundation with a nonprofit. And so I had a budget and hired some friends that I grew up with, and we kind of set up like a remote office for this nonprofit organization where I'm at now in Fort Collins. And so my first job out of college was like, I had complete control over like my schedule. And so, we had an office that we kind of like went into most days, but I actually remember thinking like, and this was part of the challenge with it, is I actually wanted more accountability in it. And I remember realizing like I could not work for like 3 days. And I never did this, but I remember having this thought. I could not work for 3 days and say, I don't know, I was sick, or maybe even say nothing. And I don't think anybody would really notice, and realizing like, man, this is not that great. And so one thing I've had to work through and try to overcome is, I do feel like the first few years of work out of college for me, it didn't reinforce a super strong work ethic. because I was like in a culture where there wasn't much accountability. There wasn't really that much clarity on leadership. There wasn't a ton of clarity. It was very empowering. So it was very like go and create value and go and do your thing. But I struggled with that piece. And so I think for me, I love the flexibility. Like, I work from home at different times. I've worked out of, we've had offices and co-working spaces and different things like that. But there's always been flexibility. And so for me, I've been trying to add more structure in a more like healthy way because I don't do very well if it's just like, all right, what does the day have for me? So even just this week, I've been journaling and reflecting on like, what is not just like, what does the ideal day look like? I think that's kind of not silly. It's just kind of framing a question in that way is going to be helpful for people and not helpful for some.
Sure.
But for me, I was like, what would when I'm proud of the day that I had, like when I come to the end of a day and I imagine myself like proud of how that day went, what did it include? Like what was a part of it? What was not a part of it? So I'm starting to reflect. And it's funny, you mentioned the Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday thing, because I'm doing very similar stuff to realize that kind of Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday are meetings days. And I'm trying my best to have 2 days a week where I can actually work on the business.
Yeah.
Do things like practicing solitude, practicing reflection, practicing deep work chunks. And so it's a balance where right now things are probably like 70% more in meetings and working on tasks and different things. And then this 30% like harder to measure, but deeply important work of thinking through business problems and planning and different things like that. But it's kind of it's evolving. I feel very aware that it'll probably look a little different in a year or 2 years than it does now.
And that's important because you're evolving as a person and you're getting different inputs and different influences. And it looks, from the looks of your bookshelf, it looks like you like reading a lot as well. So
I do like reading, but I find myself not reading as much as I would like to.
Yeah.
But,
I love that it's color coordinated too. It reminds me of my partner, Natalie's iPhone. She recently adjusted her iPhone icons to make them color coordinated.
Yeah.
And so when you look at it, she just swiping through and just gradually goes through the colors of the rainbow. So similar ethos there.
That's funny. That's awesome.
And the thing that I've been finding more helpful lately from a reading perspective is reading on Kindle and then having my highlights in there and then syncing that up with the Readwise app, which I don't know if you've seen that or familiar with that. But Readwise is a great app because you open it up in the morning and then depending on what you've highlighted in your Kindles and you've synced, it pulls those highlights into your Readwise app. So, and then you could pick how many you want. I pick like 8 different highlights. So I scroll through the highlights. So it shows you the quote from the book. Cool. And it's kind of like that recurring, there's something about there's a certain like memory tactic there, I think, in terms of like seeing the input. And sometimes something that I just read will show up pretty recently. So it comes in handy. And I think it also has an option to scan. So it has a great OCR app built in. So if you're reading the physical book, you can literally scan that segment and then it'll drop that into your updates as well. So, I'm with you. I think I've gained so much from reading and I'm always worried that it's not sinking in because in the moment you're just like, yes, that's it, highlighting it. And then like you forget it. So I think having a system for how I learn from books has been really helpful for me.
I'm curious, have there been any I haven't really tried to read books on podcasting. So if any of our friends that have written books on podcasting are listening to this, I apologize. But have there been books on podcasts? I know there's not a ton, but there are some. Like, have there been books on podcasting that you've enjoyed reading?
The one that I constantly am referring to, and we've pulled bits of it for like the work we do with clients, is Eric Newsom's Make Noise. And he worked at Audible and really smart guy and really understands. They launched a couple of high profile shows when he was there, and just kind of the way he approaches, thinking through your show and some of the exercises that we do now, like plan your first 12 episodes, and, we talk about this with clients a lot, because the title is an SEO friendly field. And so, before we even think about recording or mics or location, I have them start working on that exercise because, it helps them think about the content they're going to create as opposed to just saying, okay, I've got everything ready. I've got my cover art. I've got my description and my name, and I've recorded my trailer and I can go. And then I've just seen it from experience before. And even I remember early days you get to that place where you're just like, you don't know who you're going to speak to, or you're scrambling for a guest, or you're scrambling for content. And I think there's something to be said for really thinking through and probably related, circling back to that, your work on storytelling. What's the story you want to tell and who are you telling that story to? And what's that theme you're carrying through your show, which I think is really important.
When I think I think that's I'll have to check that one out because that's something we've been seeing I think I'm seeing it more in the industry, and I think I'm also seeing it just in my own like shows that I listen to and how I look at the podcasting space is the importance of actually thinking through what you're about to produce and thinking through the conversation beforehand. And not that there's not a place for, live interviews and doing things like that, but I kind of think that people are getting sick of, and I say low quality, I'm not meaning like camera, not meaning like the tactical quality stuff, but like low quality from you're going into the interview and you don't know what's going to happen. And not that it can't be organic, but like you're not thinking through what is the one thing that like my audience wants to hear. And again, it goes to the hero's journey of this show is not your show. Like it's not your show. Like who is that? Who is your audience? What questions are they asking? And how is this solving their problems? And so we're talking a lot more with our clients about planning their episodes and spending more time on that. And the funny thing is it's more work. It means more work for the host. But we've ended up having conversations of like, well, should we say that we can produce a podcast for 4 hours of your time a month? Where it's like, technically I can. Like you do 4 1-hour long meetings. Like technically you can. But what if to actually have a successful podcast, it takes 20 hours a month for a host? It's like, I don't know the number. I don't know what it is, but we've been having this conversation internally of like, what commitment does it actually take? And even if that means there's less shows that are starting, if they have a higher chance of longevity and quality and engagement, like those are a lot of the conversations we're having as a team. Is like, how do we kind of return back to, rather than just churning and burning as many episodes as you can, actually having thoughtful content that solves real problems?
Yeah, because at the end of the day, pod fading is a real thing. And, I've gone through waves. If you do the math on my show, I'm closing in on 10 years this show next month.
Amazing.
And so it's been a crazy hero's journey for my show. And I'm at 340 plus, something like that. So, the math on that doesn't pan out to one a week. But there's been some times where it's just been like a couple of weeks and then I'm back in the groove now, which is fun. And I think I've been more selective about who I invite on the show. Not necessarily selective, but just kind of like paying attention to like who I have conversations with, because I want to feel like, and this is something for anyone that's podcasting, you look at the calendar and you see you've got an interview coming up. It should give you like a good feeling. You should feel like a bit excited or just like interested to see, who this guest is and what we're going to talk about and where the conversation is going to go. And so if you ever look at the calendar and you're dreading the upcoming interview for your own show, I mean, that's probably a red flag right there.
Yeah. And that was part of why I actually shut down my first show, the Small Business Storytellers, was I was kind of just going through these interviews and I got really sick of having conversations. The people were great. They were amazing. There was like, everybody I interviewed was fantastic except for one person, which I thought he was fantastic. And then I got barraged once it got published by like a community of that person's customers that had all been scammed. And they were like, how are you giving this person a platform? And so I ended up taking all the content down. But everybody was amazing. But it was like the system that I had built and that I was kind of following, which at the time a lot of people were doing, was, okay, you do these 30-minute business interviews, okay, tell me your story.
Sure.
Okay, that's cool. Ask a couple custom questions. Tell me what you do. And then I'm hoping that the show grows because you're going to share it with your audience. And you're hoping that your business grows because you're hoping that I share it with my audience. And it just wasn't energizing and wasn't working. And so then I had to step back and I was like, you know what? This is not super life-giving for me. And so it was about a year ago that I decided to publish the last episode. And then the last 6 months or so, I've been working on a new concept that is super energizing for me, is going to be a lot more creative and fun to work on. And that's reflective of like the season that I'm in business, which is different than when I started that last show. So yeah, it was an interesting decision to realize like, man, it might be time to say we've done 100 episodes. Let's be grateful for that and say this was awesome. And then let's bring this journey to a close and we're going to start a new one. And that's going to be, who knows how long that'll be.
It's interesting when you talk about how much work is involved, because I notice it in some of our clients who have bigger teams. And when I think about the role, I was in a client meeting recently and there was like, I think like 6 or 7 people, like it was just me and I think my ops person on the call, and they had like six or 7 people on there on a call. And I'm just like, I mean, all these people are doing individual things related. She's got a successful
Yeah.
like health and nutrition business. So she's got someone for the website, someone for marketing, someone for social. She's got like a chief communication or like a chief of staff, and she's got, an assistant. And it's so funny because indie podcasters or solo podcasters, they're wearing all those hats, and all those things need to get done. But if you're just getting started with your own solo show, like you have to do all the things. And I remember with Podcast Junkies, I had to create the artwork. I had to schedule the interview. I had to interview the guest. I had to edit the interview. I had to write some social copy. I had to create graphics. I had to order t-shirts and go to Podcast Movement and just do some guerrilla marketing and just all those things. I felt like one of those, the buskers who he's playing the guitar and he's got the harmonica.
5 instruments.
He's got the tambourine. He's got doing some with his foot. He's got a drum as well like that. It was just doing all those things at once. And I'm wondering if you see that same challenge and how you help work your clients through those challenges, or just manage expectations of hey, here's a little idea of what you're signing up for.
Yeah, I think a lot of it for us, we've seen value in kind of being able to be that one-stop shop for our clients. Obviously, as you work with a more upstream in the business space, they're going to have teams that they want you to integrate with. And so that's kind of just a reality. And it is always a little bit more challenging. I don't know who in the industry said it, but I remember hearing some session one time where they were like, yeah, you pretty much need to, the bigger the client, you kind of need to charge like a pain in the ass tax. And
that does make sense, and that resonates.
And I've kind of seen that it's when earlier in my days, I thought oh man, why would I charge double or triple for a Fortune 500 company than for this? But then you start to work with clients that have all of these teams, and you just realize it's just infinitely more complicated.
Oh yeah.
It's way more challenging. There's a higher chance of it not working. And so there needs to be more budget for things that you can't predict in order to integrate with those teams. And so I think that's the reality for kind of the upstream, the bigger kind of your enterprise level clients, is there's going to be teams that you just have to figure out how to integrate with. And not every podcaster is going to want to do that. I think we've found a lot of value in kind of in the mid-market for growing, but still kind of small, medium-sized businesses being able to handle all of that. I know early on, in 2020 and 2021, I was doing all the things that you were saying. It was me and a virtual assistant, and then we were doing it for a couple shows. And then I remember somebody asked me to launch a daily show, and so we did a daily show for 2 months. And
that must have been fun.
It was interesting. I jumped on a call with them. They said they wanted to start a daily show and they wanted it to be live within 48 hours. And I said, God. Yes, I can do it. And I asked for more money than I ever had at that point, which I thought was a ton of money. And they wired me the money that day. And I was like, oh, wow, this is actually real. And so what it did, though, was it forced me to figure out the processes.
Sure.
And it forced me it was a project that I couldn't manage on my own. So it also forced me to start thinking through the processes as a team.
Yeah.
Now, we still have a fairly small team of 6, but it's we have different disciplines. And so when we're talking to a team or, a client, we're able to kind of say, by hiring an agency, you're getting multiple disciplines, as opposed to trying to hire just a one-trick pony that is pretty good at a lot of things. So I think that was a transition for us, but we've seen a lot of value in, on my end, us working through all of the challenges of being able to handle all those details and all those different things, because a lot of clients, they're just I don't want to handle any of the details. I want to focus on the creative, or I want to focus on creating content. And that's kind of the sweet spot for businesses.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah.
Is where the host, whether it's the founder or whoever it might be, where they can just focus on the content, and then they can trust that everything else is going to happen. But it's not reality for everybody.
How you mentioned putting some procedures together, and so how important are systems for you, whether they be SOPs or documenting processes?
They're super important. And for people that don't think they are, I like to, our team was actually just talking about this today, because we just switched everything over to ClickUp. And so for the last couple of months, we've been building out ClickUp so that we can
same here.
kind of manage more clients. And so, you think about it, let's say an episode has 10 tasks to get done, which most episodes have 20 or 30 if you're really breaking down all the little tasks that need to be done. And then you're managing 10 shows, and then you're doing it weekly episodes. And it's okay, well, that's 40 episodes a month, and you're probably working on 6 weeks of episodes at a time. And it pretty quickly gets into that's 6, 7, 800 different tasks that
Yeah.
are in motion at a time. And so I think pretty early on, I realized that I can't keep track of that in my head. So we had somebody that I hired as a content manager that was really administratively gifted. And so she's now our operations manager. And so her main role right now is kind of like the system side of things. And so it's definitely not perfect, but before having some of these like systems in place, I was just always nervous that something was going to break and that I was going to forget something, because it's inevitable. It's inevitable that our systems now will break. And so then before we had those things in place and SOPs and figuring that out, I was just like always felt nervous because I was just like, I'm going to forget something.
Yeah, something's
going to fall through the cracks. Yeah. So it's super important, just still figuring it out.
Yeah. And I think the key with it is when you find something that breaks, have a process for like diagnosing it and just kind of going back and just with the team and seeing where, because there's inevitably something that could have been communicated better. And I learned like from early days with VAs, like you have to be like really black and white, like especially working with like offshore teams, like they don't handle variety pretty well or anything that's gray. Like it literally has to be like a black and white instruction, and they don't, because they don't deal with ambiguity that well. So it's just kind of those learning those things over time as well.
Yeah.
But
I think the hardest thing with that right now is we have a good system for all the production, but on my side, like the projects I'm involved in or like the way my brain thinks about things, there's like that 10 to 20% of stuff that we work on that doesn't quite fit into all of our systems. Yeah. That's challenging.
So for the benefit of folks that are listening who are generally folks in the podcasting space, I'm just curious, what do you see or what do you think about what's happening in the podcast landscape in terms of like, I listen to pod news on a regular basis. So, just kind of keep up to date with what's happening, what Apple's doing to change things. The fact that they're adding transcriptions in there is now good. I follow what's happening with podcasting 2.0. So when you look at things that are moving the needle for your clients, what's one or two things that you think is helpful to share with this audience in terms of like things they could be thinking about for their own show?
Yeah, I mean, I think overall, I think Apple's made some really good changes in the last 6 months, and it doesn't sound like this would be the case, but Apple hasn't changed a ton with podcasting in the last like 10 years. So I think even though that iOS update was painful for a lot of clients and having to explain that to them, like I think readjusting to where numbers are accurate is a really good thing. And I think it's just like, it's a big win. I think accurate data is really huge. I think one thing that I'm really excited about is a little bit of what we were talking about before of just higher quality content and kind of resetting the standard for what a good show is. And so some of how that's looking for us is even like making the interview process, like the pre-interview process, a little clunkier. It's still user friendly, but like people actually having to do work. And so like an example is we had a client, they have a questionnaire and they really like talking about stories and not principles. They don't want people to come on and just share, okay, here's my 5 things and my 6 things and all this stuff. They want to hear like, what are the stories that have, changed your business? And so we have a form that we send them and our associate producer connects them. And we sent one of the guests the form and he responded back and he was just like, I'm locked and loaded. I'm ready to go. I don't need to fill this out. And so we canceled the interview and I reached out to him and I did it tactfully, but I kind of just said, I was like, hey, like we want to respect your time.
Sure.
And this host is actually putting time into preparing and thinking through the conversation that he wants to have for his audience. And I said, we also want this to be valuable for you. And so we worded it well, but I think that's becoming something that we're just talking a lot more about. And we're looking at like, how can we actually have higher quality guests that, yes, like I realize that as you're coming on a show, you probably want somebody to hire you from that show. Like that's fine, but be thinking about the audience first, like be thinking about the value that you can give. So I think that's something that like, it's a conversation that we're just like regularly having is what are things that we can do to make the actual conversations and the actual stories on shows more valuable for the host and for the guest. So that's taken up a lot of brain space and I'm excited about it. I mean, overall, I think that more people are getting access and easier access to podcasting. I think the YouTube integration is complicated, but I think it's like good to get everything everywhere. That's kind of where I'm approaching it.
Another layer in terms of the production, because it's a whole skill set, because there's people who are YouTube creators who started on YouTube and they've really like dialed in the algorithm. They know what exactly, they spend like probably a bunch of time just on the cover art image,
Yeah.
on the tagline, on literally like the hook for the video, because they're in the habit of like getting people to like watch the video and pull them in with that like
Yeah.
hook. And from a podcasting perspective, we talk about having these elaborate and long titles that explain to the listener the journey they're about to go on, but you can't stick that whole title on the YouTube cover. So interesting to figure out where's the balance there, because you want them to have success there. Because I think the latest numbers that came out are the fact that they're, depending on the age range or the demographic, when people think of podcasts, they're going to YouTube first.
Yeah. And I mean, I think YouTube is huge for the discoverability side. I think a lot of the reports that we see, and I'm heading to Podcast Evolutions in a couple days, and I'm sure there'll be a lot of sessions about video where they're saying that more people are consuming podcasts, whatever the language is, on YouTube than other platforms. I still think the missing piece there is, like, if you ask me what platforms I've consumed a podcast on in some format in the last month, YouTube would technically cross that. Yeah. Spotify would technically cross that. Apple Podcasts would technically cross that. So then if you survey me and you're asking, where do you consume podcasts? I'm checking all three of those. The information that I want to know is where's your like primary place of consumption? And I think that's where a lot of people are missing is, I don't know any avid podcast listeners that the primary place that they're listening or consuming podcasts is on YouTube. It might be discovering, it might be checking in with your favorite creators' clips, and all of those things are still valuable, which is why like we're doing the clip stuff, we're doing all the YouTube stuff for clients.
Sure.
But yeah, it's a really interesting thing. I'm not a huge fan of how the RSS integration works right now. It's hard to know like what to do with clients.
Well, it's also educating them as well, because they're coming to you or they're coming to us for like guidance on what's best practice, and we're still trying stuff. And like you said, if they're not putting in the work to kind of engage with what's on content that's being consumed on YouTube, unless that's part of what you offer, they've got to have a resource that's looking at what's happening there. And then you got to start to pull in the metrics to say, okay, this is what's happening in your podcast host. This is what's happening in YouTube. Pull those together. Notice, there's different types of people, to your point, ways in which people engage on those two platforms. So it's interesting because I do think about, like, I started with Overcast, and that was like my only app, and I just live and die by Overcast. And for some reason, I don't know if it's because I'm on iPhone 10 and I'm just like delaying my iPhone upgrade. It's just laggy, and it's been really slow and crashing, and I've been consuming a lot more on Spotify. And so it's interesting to see how all the different people are responding. And you now have to basically say you can find us on Spotify, Apple, or wherever you consume your favorite podcast, and you just got to make sure it's available on all platforms. Yeah,
it is interesting. There's one podcast conversation that I heard this week that I felt like it was significant for me. I'll remember it for a long time. It was also interesting because I watched the video version of this podcast, and I actually watched most of it on Spotify. And it was probably the first episode that I've like actually watched most of the video on. And it was an interview with MrBeast and on the Colin and Samir show, which they're pretty well known amongst like YouTube creators and the creator economy. But one, it was interesting because they were talking about what you were saying with like the packaging, what they called with the thumbnails and the titles. And they were saying, I mean, obviously this is the most successful YouTuber in the world. His videos are reaching about 8% of the world's population in the last 90 days. So he say, so not like repeat, the unique viewers that have seen a MrBeast video in the last 90 days, it was like 900 million people.
Wow.
Which is crazy. Like that's actual percentage points of the world. But he was saying that like they have thumbnails and titles planned out that they're working on for the next year, that they're planning with their team, and they're going through creative. And it was interesting because some level of that is not possible in podcasting. I get that. But it was interesting. And we talked about it in our team meeting today, where we just kind of like started to ask the question, like, what does it look like for us to be more intentional about like the packaging of how everything is going out around an episode? Like I don't know where the conversation will go, but I think that was really interesting. And then on that episode, he announced that he just signed a deal with Amazon Prime. And so he's going to be hosting a show, which now it's the big news. So any article that you read about this, they're talking about this podcast episode. And he said on the episode, he's like, yeah, we thought about releasing a press release, and then I figured I'd just come on this podcast and talk about it. And
course.
that was really interesting because it was like you have
interesting,
the human in the world today that has the most eyeballs,
Yeah.
that has huge news for creators to share. Amazon's probably going to spend over $100 million on this project.
Wow.
And he's like, well, let's just talk about it on a podcast. And so I thought that was really, really cool because it was just like, man, I hope little things like this begin to shift to where a lot of people still aren't really thinking about podcasting. And so if we can have these big conversations that are usually like news bites and sound bites, it's like, what if those are actual conversations on podcasts and we learn about really important things happening in our world, not from press releases, but from hearing the context around a conversation for 30 minutes. And so that was an interesting thing that happened this week that I was just like, this might be some simple little blip, but it also might be one of a little bit more significant moment in the podcasting timeline where it's like, this seems like a significant thing.
Yeah, it feels like it's adding legitimacy to the platform, which I think is great. There's another platform that starts with a D. I heard James mention in our pod news. It's a search engine that's driven off of podcasts, and all the big shows of like Jordan Harbinger's got his stuff on there. And you go into the platform and you ask, on which episode did Jordan talk to blah, blah, blah about this and this topic? And it just kind of scours like his entire catalog. And I think you've got to obviously upload your content there, but it's kind of this combination of like what we're seeing with like the AI chat bots and basically seeing like there's no shortage of content out there now because of all, if you think about all these podcast episodes, I mean, if I were to do that to like the 340 episodes I had, there's like nuggets of wisdom. So now it's almost like, how do we, and I think the AI is helping, like how do we curate and get all this information that's out there so that the end consumer is getting value out of everything we've created? Because it's not that we need to create more content in some cases. It's just like help them find the answers for stuff that's already out there.
Yeah. I mean, podcasting has always struggled with like a curation or discoverability or that element that we go to YouTube, we can type in something we're interested in, and we can see a lot of results on it. And we all know that search engines inside of podcasting apps kind of suck. Like there's still the problem. It's getting much better, but there's still the problem of, I type something in and I look at a podcast. I'm like, this podcast hasn't published anything in 4 years. Why is this ranking? But it is getting better. And there's tools like that I think will be the norm. I remember, I don't know, it was maybe like 5 years ago when Gary Vee was doing his Ask Gary Vee show. And he did something like that where you could go to his website and say like marketing or Twitter or something, and it would pull up his quotes. Like now we know that he had a team that was like transcribing and categorizing all the stuff that now can be done with AI.
Yeah.
But I think things like that are going to become a lot more important. And the transcripts piece will be huge too with Apple Podcasts.
That's really driving a lot of that. So as we get to a close, wrapping up the conversation, I usually have a couple of questions I ask guests. The first one is, what's something you've changed your mind about recently?
I think I'm going to say like recently, as in kind of the last year, has me been embracing this and becoming confident in it. And that is our position being not working with everybody. Like the transition from, can I help you start your podcast and grow it? Yes. Should I? Like changing that and realizing for a long time, I kind of thought that I'd be like leaving all of these people that need help behind in order to work with businesses.
Sure.
And now I'm realizing that the more businesses that we get to work with in a quality way actually makes our business more profitable in a way that then we can invest in things that help other people.
Yeah.
So I think for a while I was like, no, I'm going to make this working with like really small businesses. And in the last year I've realized, no, for us, like medium-sized businesses is where we can do our best work.
Yeah.
And that's been definitely a journey to change my mind on.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, because then you feel like your resources are being put to the best use possible, and you can give those clients like more of you as opposed to just figuring out like the bare minimum so you're not losing money or losing your shirt on a project.
Yeah, absolutely.
What is the most misunderstood thing about you?
I would say it probably comes down to the imposter syndrome piece. Like I think in the last 2 years, like I've been really, really grateful for the reputation that we've built, and there's a lot of confidence in there, and a lot of that confidence is supported by real projects that we've done and because I know things work.
Yeah.
But I mean, at the end of the day, it's people ask me all the time, like, oh, you're in podcasting. Isn't that great? And it's like, industry is great. Building a business is hard. Yeah. And so I think there's still the like, I come across pretty confident in a lot of ways. And that's something I've been navigating over the last couple months and really digging into is like, man, why do I lack this confidence to like take things to this next season where we feel like we're going? And so that's something I'm working through.
Seems like it's something that every entrepreneur deals with. And I think you learn this idea of whether it's imposter syndrome or handling failure better. And because in the past, it would just rock me. Like I'd either like lose a client or I'd just we'd mess up something, or even I'd start a project, invest a ton of money in it, and it wouldn't pan out. And I think nowadays I just kind of figure out how to get up faster and just kind of dust the dirt off your shoulder and just be like, well, that didn't work. What's next? Like, well, what are we going to try next? And I think you get that toughened skin or that armor, whatever it is, that helps you move forward. So it's definitely not for the faint of heart. And that's why there's just a small group of people that call themselves entrepreneurs. But I think anytime you meet others in that space, there's a camaraderie, because kind of we've all, if you've been doing it long enough, you've been in the trenches long enough, then, you've got some scars and the scars to prove it. There's a lot of stories you can share and lessons learned as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Couldn't agree more.
Seth, thank you so much for connecting again. And I know, in this world, we tend to cross paths a lot, and I haven't been able to make it out to a lot of the conferences lately. I'm going to try to make Podcast Movement in DC. It is my 10-year anniversary, so I'm going to submit a talk, see if I can get Jared to put me on stage for 10 years of Podcast Junkies. Good. So that'll be fun. If I can pull that off, that'll be cool. But yeah, I'm just glad we got the ability to connect and go deeper. That's what I love about this show, is that if we did connect at a conference, usually it's for a few minutes or just in the hallway, and then other things are happening, or it's in a noisy after party or something where you can't even talk. So I just love the ability to slow down and get to know a little bit more about you, and appreciate you connecting and sharing your story with my listeners.
Yeah, absolutely. This is great, and I appreciate what you do. And I specifically love everything you're doing with the vertical farming and that side of things, because I think you're one of the best use cases right now of like niche podcast work for businesses. And I love it. So I think about you often and appreciate what you do.
Well, I appreciate that. So if folks want to connect with you a little bit deeper or learn more about the agency, where should we send them?
Yeah, I'm pretty active on LinkedIn, and that's a good place, just with my name, Seth Silvers. And then our website is storyon.co.
Okay. And I think you've provided all those links during sign up, so we'll make sure they're all in the show notes for the listeners as well. Thanks again for your time. I really appreciate it.
Absolutely. Thank you.